Go to your kitchen. Open your refrigerator. Look at everything inside. The milk, the eggs, the leftovers you told yourself you'd eat but probably won't. Now imagine, none of this exists. No cold box humming in the corner. No freezer, no ice at all. The meat turns by tomorrow. The milk by the end of the week. The first domestic refrigerator was invented in 1913. That is barely over 100 years ago. For 99.9% of human history, there was no machine keeping your food cold. Nothing to extend the life of meat, milk, or vegetables beyond a few days. You had to learn the methods and practice them and pass them down. And yet people didn't starve every winter. They didn't survive on only fresh killed meat. They had 4 technologies, and none of them involved electricity. Controlled rot, dehydration, wood smoke, and a hole in the ground. Not modern inventions, ancient discoveries, refined over tens of thousands of years. The oldest is at least 250,000 years old. The youngest among them is still 9,000 years old. You probably used one of them this week, without thinking twice. But first, you need to understand what rot actually is. It is not a mystery. It is biology. Bacteria and fungi are everywhere, on your hands, in the air, on every surface in your kitchen. Give them warmth, moisture, and a food source, and they multiply explosively. A single bacterial cell becomes 1,000 in hours, 1,000,000 by the end of the day, and you can't see it happening. You can't smell it until the colony is already established and the food is past saving. So the question is, how do you make food unlivable for microbes without making it poisonous for yourself? Cold is one answer. That is what your refrigerator does. It slows bacterial metabolism to a crawl. But ancient humans living in warm climates had no ice. The Middle East, the tropics, the Mediterranean, none of them had any way to freeze things. They found 4 alternatives instead, each one attacking a different condition that spoilage organisms depend on: water, oxygen, warmth, or a neutral pH. The oldest trick in the book, literally, is putting food in the ground and covering it up. At Gesher Benot Ya'aqov in Israel, archaeologists found animal bones from 250,000 years ago. They'd been deliberately buried in moist clay. The cut marks show butchery, then rapid burial in selected soil, intentional, not accidental. Here is the science. Wet clay is anaerobic. It cuts off oxygen. Most spoilage bacteria need oxygen to function. Cut the oxygen, and you slow the rot by a factor of 3. Think about that. A species that was not yet fully human figured this out, 250,000 years ago. No lab, no germ theory. Just the observation that food buried in this type of clay lasted longer than food left out in the open. Later humans perfected the principle. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, 9,000 years ago, every house had storage pits dug 2 meters into the floor. They lined them with basketry and sealed the top with bark. The pits stayed at about 15 degrees Celsius year-round, cool enough to suppress bacteria, warm enough to prevent freezing. Each one held enough grain to feed a family through the winter. Let that sink in for a second. 9,000 years ago, someone understood that this year's harvest had to last until next year's. So they built underground storage into every home. No thermometers, no refrigeration, no modern tools at all. The same logic is still used in root cellars today. Keep it cool, keep it dark, and above all, keep it sealed. That principle is 250,000 years old. The second method is so obvious. You've probably never thought of it as technology. Remove the water. Bacteria need it to survive. Dry food past a certain point, below about 15% moisture, and it can last for years, sometimes decades. The earliest evidence comes from South Africa's coast. At Pinnacle Point, roughly 100,000 years ago, archaeologists found shellfish remains that had been harvested, opened, and processed in specific areas of the site. This wasn't a snack. They organized things for drying and later consumption. Planned preservation. Drying requires nothing but sun, air, and time. That is why every human culture independently invented it. North American jerky, Arctic wind, dried fish, Mediterranean figs, Australian seed flour. Elsewhere, Andean people freeze dried potatoes by leaving them out overnight and trampling the moisture out. Meanwhile, Japanese fishermen dried their catch on coastal racks. In the Caribbean, cassava was grated into flour that kept for months. By medieval Europe, salt cod had become the backbone of long-distance trade. The Vikings carried it across the North Atlantic. The age of exploration would have been impossible without it. Same principle, different food, different climate, same discovery made over and over again. The third method is the one you can smell from a block away. Smoke does two things at once. The heat dries the food from the outside, and the smoke deposits antimicrobial chemicals, formaldehyde, acetic acid, phenolic compounds, directly onto the surface. Bacteria can't tolerate them. This gives smoking an edge. It works in humid climates where air drying is too slow, like the Pacific Northwest or the British Isles. Ancient smokers also knew something most modern barbecue enthusiasts don't. The choice of wood matters. Hardwoods like oak and beech produce smoke rich in preservative phenols. Softwoods like pine produce tars that taste bitter and can ruin the meat. They knew which wood to use, for which purpose. Direct evidence is hard to find. Smoke doesn't leave obvious chemical traces on old bones. But at Neanderthal sites across Europe, 50,000 years and older, animal bones cluster around hearths. The pattern suggests meat hung above the fire rather than being cooked directly. That is the classic smoking setup. The meat is high enough to absorb smoke, low enough to avoid cooking. By the Upper Paleolithic, around 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, northern populations depended on smoked meat and fish for survival. Take the high Arctic. Fresh food is only available a few months a year. Smoking made human habitation possible. At the edge of the world. Smoked fish, smoked seal, smoked reindeer. Entire communities survived the polar winter on meat preserved by nothing but fire and wood. And then there is the weirdest one, the one that sounds like it shouldn't work at all. Instead of stopping microbial growth, you invite specific microbes in and let them do the work. The earliest evidence comes from Jiahu in China. In the 1990s, Patrick McGovern's team analyzed residue inside pottery jars dated to 9,000 years ago. They used chemical techniques, HPLC, mass spectrometry, isotope analysis, and found traces of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, along with unmistakable markers of controlled rot. They measured the alcohol content, roughly 4%. This is the oldest known processed food in the entire archaeological record. A beverage that preserved itself through the activity of the very microbes it was designed to cultivate. The trick works by lowering pH. The microbes humans selected, yeast and lactobacillus, produce alcohol and lactic acid. This drops the environment below pH 4.0. Most spoilage bacteria cannot survive at that acidity level. The good microbes create the conditions that kill their competitors. The same principle was discovered independently on every inhabited continent. Yogurt in the Middle East, 8,000 years ago. Cheese, sauerkraut, kimchi, beer, miso, bread. Every human culture came up with a version of the same idea. In Korea, the ongi pots used for kimchi are designed to breathe. The porous clay lets gases escape while keeping contaminants out. In the Caucasus, yogurt cultures have been maintained for 8 millennia. In Europe, sourdough starters are kept alive for decades. Every human culture realized the same thing. Controlled decay is better than uncontrolled decay. Now, here is the part that is worth stopping to think about. The refrigerator is barely 100 years old. In evolutionary terms, that is nothing. Yet in that single century, it made 4 old technologies unnecessary. Technologies that had been discovered independently, refined over hundreds of thousands of years, essential to human survival. All of them became optional. You don't need to know how to smoke fish anymore. The supermarket has it. The fridge didn't add anything new. It just made the old knowledge optional, and in the process, it erased an entire world of accumulated wisdom. Because before refrigeration, every household knew which woods produced the best smoking flavor, how to tell when meat was dry enough, just by feel, which seasons were right for air drying, how deep to dig a pit depending on local soil. This wasn't a specialist skill. It was basic survival knowledge passed from parent to child over tens of thousands of years. And then, in a single generation, most of it vanished. The fridge also transformed food culture. Almost every traditional cuisine in the world is built on preservation techniques that became beloved in their own right. Kimchi is fermented cabbage designed to last through the Korean winter. Prosciutto is air-dried pork that kept Italian families fed before freezers. Miso is preserved soybeans that provided protein through the Japanese winter. Sauerkraut, salted cod, cheese. All of them were invented as survival technologies, not culinary luxuries. We kept the foods. We lost the context. I'll be honest, I didn't realize any of this until I started digging into the archaeology. I grew up thinking food preservation was something you bought, not something you did. That a refrigerator was the baseline, and everything before it was primitive guesswork. It turns out the guesswork was more sophisticated than most of what we do today. So how did ancient humans preserve food without refrigeration? They buried it in clay and discovered that oxygen-free environments stop rot. They laid it in the sun and learned that removing water makes bacteria powerless. They hung it above fires and found that smoke could protect what heat alone could not. They let it transform, inviting invisible allies to acidify and preserve what would otherwise spoil in days. The oldest method is 250,000 years old. The youngest is at least 9,000. We shared these technologies with species that were not yet fully human, and you still use 3 of them every week without thinking about it. That beer in your hand, controlled rot, that prosciutto, air drying, that cheese, the yogurt in your fridge, the sourdough bread in your kitchen, all the same trick. First discovered 9 millennia ago at Jiahu, the refrigerator didn't invent food preservation. It just let us forget we ever needed to learn it. Here is a question for you. If the power went out tomorrow for a month, how long before the food in your kitchen becomes inedible? And would you know what to do with that last piece of meat before it's spoiled? Could you dry it, smoke it, maybe even bury it in the backyard? Or would you just watch it rot?